September 20, 1939, was a day marked by the tightening grip of German and Soviet forces over Poland as the last bastions of Polish resistance struggled to hold out against overwhelming odds. With Warsaw enduring an unrelenting siege, the situation for the Polish capital grew increasingly dire. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union solidified its control over eastern Poland, and the implications of a divided Poland reverberated throughout the international community. The day's events underscored the brutal reality of occupation and the strategic dilemmas faced by the Allies as they sought to respond to a rapidly evolving conflict. The Siege of Warsaw, a city on the edge of collapse. By September 20th, the German encirclement of Warsaw was nearly complete, leaving the Polish capital isolated and on the brink of collapse. The Luftwaffe continued its intensive bombing campaign, targeting both military and civilian infrastructure to demoralize the population and break the defenders' will to resist. The city, already in ruins, faced an increasingly dire humanitarian crisis as food, water, and medical supplies ran perilously low. Inside Warsaw, the situation was desperate. The city's defenders, including regular army units, local militias, and thousands of civilians, fought bravely to repel the German onslaught. Under the leadership of General Walerian Chuma and Mayor Stefan Starzyński, efforts were made to maintain morale and continue the defense of the city, but the odds were overwhelmingly against them. The relentless German bombardment and artillery barrages made any organized defense increasingly difficult. On September 20th, Warsaw's defenders faced mounting pressure as German forces prepared for a potential ground assault. The decision to continue resisting or surrender was a matter of intense debate among the city's leaders. Many argued that continued resistance would only lead to more civilian casualties and further destruction, while others believed that surrender would result in harsh reprisals and occupation. Despite the dire circumstances, the spirit of defiance among Warsaw's inhabitants remained strong. Mayor Starzyński continued his daily radio broadcasts, calling on the population to hold out against the invaders and to remember the importance of their struggle for Poland's future. Soviet advances, firming control over eastern Poland. While Warsaw remained under siege, the Soviet Red Army continued to consolidate its control over eastern Poland. Following their invasion on September 17th, Soviet forces had moved swiftly into Polish territory, encountering minimal resistance as they occupied key cities and strategic locations. The rapid Soviet advance was facilitated by the disarray of the Polish military, which was primarily focused on defending against the German advance in the west. On September 20th, Soviet troops continued to assert their authority in the occupied territories, implementing measures to integrate these regions into the Soviet state. Local government structures were dismantled, and Soviet administrators took control of civil and economic functions. The nationalization of industries and collectivization of agriculture were initiated almost immediately, reflecting the broader ideological goals of the Soviet regime and its desire to secure its newly acquired territories. The Soviet occupation was marked by a campaign of repression aimed at eliminating any potential resistance and consolidating control. Thousands of Polish military officers, civil servants, and intellectuals were arrested and deported to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions. The actions of the Soviet authorities made it clear that eastern Poland was now firmly under Moscow's control, with no tolerance for dissent or opposition. German occupation, tightening the noose on Poland. In western Poland, the German Wehrmacht continued its efforts to secure the areas under its occupation. Following the rapid defeat of Polish forces, German troops moved to establish administrative control, disarming remaining Polish units and targeting potential resistance leaders. The German occupation was characterized by harsh measures aimed at asserting control and preventing any form of organized resistance. On September 20th, German forces implemented a series of policies designed to consolidate their control over occupied Poland. This included the imposition of strict curfews, the establishment of military checkpoints, and the systematic rounding up of Polish intellectuals, military officers, and political leaders. The occupation authorities sought to crush any potential resistance through a combination of intimidation, coercion, and targeted violence. The goal was to transform the occupied territories into a secure base for further military operations and to integrate them into the Greater German Reich. German propaganda continued to frame the invasion of Poland as a necessary and defensive action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and portraying the campaign as a justified effort to protect Germany's eastern borders. This narrative was designed to maintain domestic support for the war effort and to justify the harsh measures being implemented in the occupied territories. For the Polish population, the German occupation represented a period of intense repression, marked by forced labor, arbitrary arrests, and executions. The Allied dilemma, strategic reassessments, and growing criticism. As the situation in Poland grew increasingly dire, the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, faced mounting pressure to respond more decisively. The complete occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces forced the Allies to confront a new reality. Their Eastern European ally had been effectively wiped off the map. The strategic implications of this development were profound, forcing the Allies to reassess their military and diplomatic strategies in light of the rapidly changing situation. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government faced growing scrutiny for its perceived failure to act decisively in defense of Poland. Public opinion was increasingly critical of the government's handling of the crisis, with many feeling that Britain had not done enough to support its Polish ally. On September 20th, the British War Cabinet continued to debate potential responses, including the possibility of increasing military aid to other potential victims of Axis aggression and expanding the scope of economic sanctions against both Germany and the Soviet Union. However, logistical challenges and concerns about military readiness continued to hamper the British response. The Royal Air Force, RAF, remained focused on defensive preparations, while the Royal Navy maintained its blockade of Germany in an effort to weaken the Nazi war machine through economic attrition. The British government also began to consider ways to support Polish forces that had escaped to France and other countries, recognizing the need to keep the Polish cause alive in the face of occupation. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar challenges. The French military, heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west, was not in a position to intervene directly in Poland. The French public, like their British counterparts, was increasingly frustrated with the government's perceived inaction. The complete occupation of Poland forced France to reassess its strategic priorities and how best to support the Allied cause in an increasingly hostile environment. The failure of the Allies to provide more substantial support to Poland highlighted broader strategic dilemmas. Both the British and French governments were wary of provoking a broader conflict before they were fully prepared. But this cautious approach also meant that Poland had been left to face the German and Soviet onslaught largely alone. The events of September 20th underscored the limitations of the Allied military and diplomatic strategies and the need for a more coordinated and decisive approach to countering the Axis and Soviet threats. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and strategic recalculations. The occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces and the imminent fall of Warsaw prompted strong reactions from the international community. Many nations began to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly changing landscape of the war. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 20th, discussions within the U.S. government continued to focus on expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash-and-carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 20th, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Other neutral nations, such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, continued to bolster their defenses and prepare for potential spillover from the conflict. These countries, aware of their strategic positions and vulnerabilities, sought to maintain their neutrality while preparing for potential threats from both the Axis and Allied powers. The The situation was particularly tense in Belgium and the Netherlands, where fears of German invasion prompted increased military readiness and diplomatic efforts to secure guarantees of neutrality. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 20th, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and the Daily Telegraph reported on the continued siege of Warsaw and the firm establishment of Soviet control in eastern Poland with a sense of urgency and condemnation. Coverage emphasized the plight of the Polish people and the need for a more robust Allied response. Editorials called for increased support for other potential victims of Axis aggression and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Warsaw and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary and justified action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the campaign as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the Soviet Union, state media maintained a narrative of neutrality and defense, presenting the invasion as a necessary step to protect ethnic minorities and restore order in Eastern Europe. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the Red Army as liberators, bringing stability and protection to the peoples of the eastern regions of Poland. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 20, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked a further descent into occupation and repression, as the fall of Warsaw seemed imminent and the country was effectively divided between two totalitarian powers. The Allied powers faced a complex set of challenges as they grappled with how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. For the United Kingdom and France, the day highlighted the difficulties of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict they had hoped to avoid and were faced with strategic uncertainties regarding how best to respond to the expanding scope of the war. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support other nations threatened by Axis aggression, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war. Internationally, the continued advance of German and Soviet forces into Poland prompted further reassessments and strategic recalibrations. The United States maintained its official stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential global implications of the conflict. Italy and other nations watched closely, each calculating how best to navigate the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape to their advantage. Conclusion: a war deepening and global stakes rising. September 20, 1939, was a day of profound significance, as the continued siege of Warsaw and the consolidation of Soviet control over eastern Poland highlighted the brutal realities of the Second World War. The events of this day underscored the challenges of coalition warfare, the limits of pre-war planning and preparation, and the unpredictable nature of a conflict that was beginning to engulf much of Europe and threaten global stability.